Welcome back. We are now in part 4 of Introduction to Warhammer 40k 8th edition. In part 4 we will be talking about the shooting phase. So just to recap slightly, if we look at the first page of the core rules, we'll see the battle round, and this outlines each step of a player's phase or a player's turn. We've already talked about the movement phase and then the psychic phase, so we're going to be moving on now to the shooting phase. So we'll turn a few pages in here, and you can see just past the psychic phase, we get to the shooting phase. Now the shooting phase is a bit more involved than some of the other phases we've already talked about. So let's take a close look and see what the shooting phase looks like. So just to give us a quick outline here of what the shooting phase entails, we have this nice little outline. You're going to first choose a unit to shoot with. You're going to choose the targets. You'll choose the ranged weapon you're going to shoot with. You're going to resolve attacks, which is going to involve making a hit roll, making a wound roll. The enemy will allocate wounds. The enemy will make any saving throws they might have, and then you inflict damage. Pretty straightforward, but let's break it down. Okay, so in our example here, we've got a couple units of Space Marines with a Space Marine captain, and then we got 2 units of Orc Boys led by an Orc Knob. So if we pretend it's the Space Marine shooting phase, we have 3 units here. 1 unit of Space Marines, another unit of Space Marines, and then the captain. What we're going to do is we're going to choose any of these units to go ahead and shoot first. Now of course they have to have ranged weapons to shoot, so we'll pick one of the units and they will do their shooting attack first. A couple rules to remember about the shooting phase though is that a unit cannot shoot if they have advanced in the movement phase before. Again, advancing is when you roll that extra die and add it to your movement. You also can't shoot if you've fallen back. Now I'll talk about falling back in a different video, but just know that if you have fallen back you also can't shoot. Now there are some exceptions to that, but in general you can't do it. Now another rule for the shooting phase is that a unit cannot shoot if they're within 1 inch of an enemy model. So take for example the Space Marine unit right here. They're within 1 inch of those Orc Boys and so would not be able to fire at them. Now there are some exceptions to this rule too, but in general if you're within 1 inch of an enemy unit you're not going to be able to shoot. So say we've selected this unit here to make its shooting attack, we then need to target a unit. So to target a unit, you need to be able to pick an enemy unit that again is over 1 inch away and is within range of the weapon that you choose to fire. So you might recall this sheet from the data sheet video. That was a few videos back, but here if we look at weapons, and again we're pretending that these Space Marines are intercessors for the purpose of this video, and they're going to be equipped with bolt rifles. If we look at the range of the bolt rifle, we'll see it's 30 inches. We also see that there are things called type, strength, armor piercing value, and damage. We'll get to those in a second. The first thing we wanted to know is, are the Space Marines within range of the Orc Boys? So we need to know, are they within 30 inches of the Orc Boys? So let's take a look at this unit firing its bolt rifle from here to the Orc Boys over here. So we get out our measuring tape and we're gonna see, are these guys within 30 inches? Now this is extended to 12 inches, and so we can see that even the back guy in this back row of the unit is well within 30 inches of the Orc Boys in front of them, which means that they would be able to fire at the Orc Boys because they're within range. The other important thing to remember is, do they have line of sight to the Orc Boys, which essentially means from the model, can they see an Orc Boy, any piece of them? And in this case, they're standing right in front of them, so of course it's pretty easy to see. We'll talk about things like cover and cover saves that the terrain might be able to benefit you if you are getting shot. But for right now, we'll keep it simple and just know that the Space Marines have line of sight to the Orc Boys there. Now, another caveat to the shooting phase is, well, what if I have a model in the back here and they're having to direct line of sight through their own units? Can they still see the orcs? For the purposes of shooting in line of sight, you can see through your own models within a unit. So this guy here can easily see through the 3 Space Marines in front of him to direct his shot to the orcs. Another important thing to know about the shooting phase, and we brought this up already with the rule that is, if you're within 1 inch of an enemy unit, you can't shoot in the shooting phase. Well, the same goes if a unit is wanting to fire into an enemy unit, but another one of their friendly units is within 1 inch of that enemy unit. This unit also cannot shoot at that enemy unit. They can shoot in the shooting phase if they're outside of 1 inch from an enemy unit, but if there's a friendly unit within 1 inch of an enemy unit, they can't fire at that enemy unit. This is to represent that you don't want your own models hitting your friendly models. Now, as you saw from the data sheet, models may have more than one weapon, and a model is allowed to shoot all of its weapons during the shooting phase. In fact, it can shoot all of its weapons at one unit, or you can declare that it's going to shoot certain weapons at one unit and a different weapon at another unit. To expand on this idea, if a unit is made up of more than one model, you can actually declare that different models in the unit are going to shoot at different enemy units. So a whole unit doesn't have to fire all of its shots into a single enemy unit, rather it can actually split up its shots against different enemy units. So as an example, these two Space Marines may want to fire their bolt rifles at this squad of orcs over here that are coming in to charge, while the other 4 Space Marines may want to dump their bolt rifle shots into this orc unit right in front of them. While you can split up your shots like that, the important thing to remember is that you have to declare where all your shots are going prior to rolling any dice. So if all of these guys had bolt rifles, they would have to declare where all of those shots were going to go to which enemy unit before they started rolling. So you couldn't have these 4 Space Marines shoot their bolt rifles at this enemy unit, and if it killed them, then choose to have these 2 shoot their bolt rifles into this enemy unit. You'd have to declare that from the start. These 4 are going to shoot at this enemy unit, these 2 are going to shoot at this enemy unit, and now I'm going to roll to see if they hit. So now returning to the shooting phase of our Space Marines here, we've selected this unit to fire into this enemy unit of orcs here. We saw that they're within range of their bolt rifles and they have line of sight to the orcs. So what we want to know now is how many attacks do these bolt rifles have? Well, let's take a look at the data sheet again to check that out. So we're back again to the data sheet of our Space Marines here. And we want to know information about the bolt rifle because that's what they want to shoot into those orcs with. Now, you might remember I said a model equipped with more than one weapon can shoot those weapons during the shooting phase. They don't just have to shoot the one. And in fact, if you look at war gear, it says that each of these models is equipped with a bolt rifle, a bolt pistol, frag grenades, and crack grenades. And of course, all of those things have a weapon profile below. But for the simplicity of this demonstration, we're just going to shoot the bolt rifles. So we know they're within 30 inches of those orcs, but we want to know how many attacks do these Space Marines get to make against those orcs. So we have 6 Space Marines, and they each have a bolt rifle. To know how many attacks we're going to make, we actually look at type. And if we look here on this line, it says rapid fire 1. The number there indicates how many shots that the weapon gets to make each time in the shooting phase. Now there is a bit more that you need to know than just looking at the number. Of course, here you can see that there are a bunch of numbers for different weapons. In fact, a pistol also has 1, indicating that you get 1 shot. A grenade has D6, indicating you would roll 1 die, and then whatever the value was on the die is how many attacks you would get. So if you rolled a 5, you would get 5 attacks, and then a crack grenade gives you 1. It's 1 grenade shot. So we actually need to know more than just the number value following the type of weapon that it is. We actually need to know about the type of weapon, because that can also affect the number of shots that you get. So the bolt rifle is a rapid fire 1. So we need to know, what does rapid fire mean and how does that affect the number of attacks the Space Marines get to make against those orcs? To find out more about the type of weapon you have, we're going to turn back to the rule book, and in the shooting phase, it will describe some of the different types of weapons you might be able to fire. So here we are back in the rule book, looking at the shooting phase, and we're trying to figure out the number of attacks these Space Marines get to make. It was a rapid fire 1 weapon. What we're going to do is turn the page And what you'll find is on this back page, we have different types of weapons. I'm not going to go into detail of all of these types of weapons. You can check them out for yourself. We want to know what's relevant for this shooting phase demonstration. So we want to check out rapid fire. So looking at the rapid fire rules, what we see is a rule that states a model firing a rapid fire weapon doubles the number of attacks it makes if its target is within half the weapon's maximum range. So what do we know about the bolt rifle? The bolt rifle's range is 30 inches. So if you're making the shot to an enemy unit within 15 inches of the bolt rifle, then you get to double your attack. So let's put that piece of information together with what we know about the weapon's profile. We know that it shoots 30 inches, so if it's within 15 inches, we can double the number of shots that each of these Space Marines is making. So it's rapid fire 1, meaning that it is going to make 1 shot per attack in the shooting phase. So if we're within 15 inches of the enemy unit, doubling that makes it 2 shots. So let's check out our Space Marines and see if any of them might be within 15 inches of the orc unit so that they can fire 2 shots into them instead of just the 1. So here's our firing unit again, and here are our orcs that we're firing into. So getting out our trusty measuring tape, at 12 inches, we see that actually all of them are within that 15-inch range, meaning that all of them would get to double their attack. So if they're firing 6 attacks into the orcs, doubling that means there's going to actually be 12 shots that will be fired. Now just to give another example of a different type of scenario, what if this unit was firing into the orcs, but maybe only the front 5 were within 15 inches and this back one here was at 16 inches? Well, the front 5 would get to double their attack, but this back one here, he'd only get 1 single attack because he's still within 30 inches of making a shot, but he's not within that rapid fire range. So now this unit's getting ready to make its shot. We've got 12 attacks represented by the 12 die here, and they're all going to go into this enemy orc unit right out in front. Now keep in mind that I could have split these attacks up. I could have said that these 3 are firing into that orc unit and these 3 are going to fire into this orc unit. And that way I would be separating the die, making 6 attacks over there if they were within the 15-inch range to do rapid fire, and I'd be doing 6 attacks over here into this enemy unit over here. I can make that distinction because none of the dice have been rolled. You have to declare all of your attacks before you make any kind of rolls to see if they hit. We haven't made any rolls yet to hit, so I could technically separate these attacks out. But we're just going to shoot directly into that unit and keep it simple. So 12 shots into that unit. But before I do that, we need to know, well, what value do I need to roll to hit these guys over here? To know that, we again look back at the data sheet. So here's our model's data sheet again, and we want to know, what do we need to roll for the bolt rifle to make sure that we hit those orcs? To know what value you need on the die, we need to know how accurate our Space Marines are at shooting their weapons. To do that, we actually look at the model's profile up here. So we have our intercessors, and what we want to know is we want to know their ballistic skill, represented by the BS. That's their accuracy of making shooting attacks. So you can see that both the sergeant and the intercessors here are a 3+, which means when we roll those die, we need a 3 or greater to hit the orcs. So let's take our 12 die and see what we get. So now we're going to separate anything that is a 3 or greater. So our Space Marines over here are pretty accurate at their shooting. Here's all the hits they had, and here are all the misses. But we don't stop there. Now we need to know, do these shots actually wound the orcs? We know they've been hit, but do they actually wound the orcs? To do that, we need to look at both the strength of the weapon as well as the toughness of those orcs. So now looking back at our Space Marines profile, we want to look at the bolt rifle, since that's what we're actually shooting the orcs with. We know the type already, the range. Now we have another value to check out, and that is the S here, which is the strength. The strength of the bolt rifle is strength 4. That's one of the pieces of information we're going to need to know when checking whether or not the orcs have been wounded by the attack. The second piece of information we need to know is the orc's toughness. So here's our orc boy's profile, And the second piece of information we need to know is the orc boy's toughness. So if we look at their profile, again, we have movement, weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, and T for toughness. Their toughness is 4. So we know that the strength of the bolt rifle is 4, and the orc boy's toughness is 4. Those are the two pieces of information we need to know when figuring out whether or not an attack that has hit is going to wound. So now that we know our two pieces of information, we need to do some sort of mental calculation here real quick, which is pretty simple. They have a chart here actually set up for us so that you can learn this and memorize it, but once you kind of get the hang of it, it's pretty easy to figure out. So we need to make a wound roll, and we're gonna do that by taking all those dice that hit, remember, which were 3 or greater, to see if they actually wound. So we have to roll them again. We again need to know what value we need to determine if it was a successful wound roll. To do that, we check out this chart here. What you'll see is that if the weapon's strength is twice or more than the enemy model's toughness, you need to roll a 2 or greater. If the strength of the weapon is greater than the toughness, but not necessarily twice as much, then you just need a 3+. If the strength of the weapon is equal to the toughness of the model, then you need to roll a 4 or greater. This is going to be the case in our situation here, where the bolt rifle is strength 4 and the orc toughness is also 4. But if the strength is lower than the toughness, so if the weapon was strength 3 and the orc's toughness is 4, then you need to roll a 5 or greater. And if the strength is half or less than the toughness of the model, you need to roll a 6 or greater. This represents maybe using a weak weapon against a really tough enemy. The only way you're going to hit them and wound them is on a 6+. So now, looking at the chart, we know we need to roll a 4 or greater with all those dice that we have left from those successful hit rolls. So here are our remaining dice, the ones that we successfully rolled a 3 or greater to determine if the models hit the orc unit over there. Now we need to see if they wound. So we need that 4 or greater. So now we're going to pull all the dice out that are 4 or more. In this case, it looks like we only have 2 shots. So of the 12 attacks we made, you'll see only 2 of them actually hit and wounded. But we're not quite done there. You see, the orcs also get to respond. They get to see if they can save these wounds. And to do that, we need to check out their armor save. So now the orc player gets to respond to the attacks from these Space Marines. It's been hit twice, 2 wounds that have to go to that unit. The first thing the orc player is going to do is it's going to allocate the wounds, which means it's going to choose a model in the unit that may end up receiving those wounds. This is important to remember because the model that the orc player chooses can actually be out of range from the weapons that were shot. So he could choose an orc boy that's way over here that's a part of the unit, but is outside of the range of the Space Marines that initially fired. He can also choose a unit that is out of line of sight from the Space Marines. So he could choose somebody that is maybe way in the back behind a building. One model he would have to choose, though, is if he had a model in his unit that already had a wound on it, he would have to start with that orc boy and then move on from there. So if this model over here had 2 wounds and it had already received 1 wound, the orc player would first have to start trying to put a second wound on him before moving to another model in the unit. For simplicity's sake, let's say he chooses this model right up front first to try to take these wounds. So let's see if this orc boy has any chance of saving these 2 wounds. When a model takes a wound because they've been hit by an attack, they have a chance to save themselves. This is called an armor save, and most models have an armor save that can be found on their profile. So as an example, looking at the orc boy here, we can look across at the very end on the right. We see the SV, and that is for save. This is a basic armor save. There are actually different types of saves in the game, including an invulnerable save, a cover save, and what we're referring to here as the armor save. We'll talk more about those other 2 types of saves in a little bit. We want to focus on the basic one here, which is the armor save. So the orc boy, he has 2 wounds that he has to try to save, and to do so, he needs to roll a 6+ on the die for each of those wounds he might take. But we actually don't stop there. In fact, the weapon profile has something called armor penetration, a value that you're going to see on the weapon's profile. And we'll turn back to that in a second. But while we're looking at the Orc Boy, the armor penetration value of the weapon will add a modifier to the armor save of the model trying to save the wound. So in this case, the Orc Boy has a 6+ save, but the bolt rifle might have an armor penetration value that will modify that 6+ save. So turning back to the Space Marine's weapon profile, under bolt rifle, we'll look at AP for armor penetration, and sure enough, what you'll notice is that there is a -1 modifier. This means that the orc that's trying to make the save against the wound will have to subtract 1 from the die roll. Now this is a problem for the Orc Boy because the Orc Boy has a 6+ save. He needs a 6 or greater. Of course on a D6 there's nothing greater than a 6 to roll. So a -1 to that means he will automatically fail these armor saves. Even if the Orc player rolls a 6, the modifier will then be applied, -1, which means it will be a 5, and the save will have failed. But let's pretend that the Orc Boy has maybe some kind of buff from a character nearby that's giving him an armor save of 5+, so a bonus to his 6+ armor save. In this case, the bolt rifle's -1 would mean the Orc Boy needs that 6+ still to be saved, because again, if he has a modified armor value of 5+, he would normally need a 5 or greater to save himself from the wound. But with the modifier applied, it means when he rolls a 5, it becomes a 4. So the only way he could save himself if he had a 5+ armor save is if he rolled a 6. So let's turn back to our boys now, and we'll pretend they have a 5+ armor save just so that we can see this demonstration play out. Now because the bolt rifle has a -1 armor penetration, it means that the Orc Boy is going to need to make a 6+ save to avoid the wound. Now each of these Orc Boys is a 1 wound model. Some models have multiple wounds, like the Knob there. A Boss Knob actually has 2 wounds. The other thing we need to remember is that some weapons do more than 1 damage. Now the bolt rifle deals 1 damage, which means if the wound goes through, it will deal 1 wound. But if the bolt rifle dealt 2 damage per wound, it would mean that for each unsaved wound, a model would take 2 damage. So in this example, if the bolt rifle shot at that Orc Boy and the Orc rolled a 3 for his armor save, failing his armor save, it means 1 wound would be applied to that Orc Boy and he would be removed from play because he would have no more wounds left. If the Orc player tried to make the save against the Knob for that second wound that we still need to roll for, and he rolls a 2, again failing the armor save, then 1 wound would be applied to the Orc Knob, but he would still have 1 wound remaining. So you would just mark it like that, knowing that the Knob would have 1 wound left before he would have to be removed from play. But let's look at another hypothetical example though. Let's again pretend that the bolt rifle for each wound dealt 2 damage. If it dealt 2 damage and this Orc Boy had failed his armor save, he would again be eliminated. Even though he only has 1 wound and was just dealt 2 wounds, the extra wounds don't carry over into the rest of the unit. Similarly, had this Knob here tried to save from that second wound and again rolled a 2, failed the armor save, and the wounds were applied to him, because the bolt rifle would be dealing 2 damage per 1 wound, he's a 2 wound model and that would be enough to remove him from play. So just to show you where to find how much damage a weapon deals when it wounds, you look for the D just after armor penetration. D stands for damage. As you can see under the Space Marine's profile, most of its weapons deal just 1 damage, 1 wound. But the crack grenade here actually deals D3 damage, meaning if it does wound, you roll a die, and then if it's a, 3 or 4, it might be dealing 2 damage for each successful wound that went through. The important thing to remember here is that if you have a weapon that deals more than 1 damage every time it wounds an enemy, the rest of the wounds are not spilled over into the rest of the unit, even if the damage is excessive or more than what is required to kill the single model that was trying to make the save. The example we used was if a 2 damage weapon the Space Marine fired at an Orc Boy with 1 wound failed to save and died, that extra wound would not be carried over into the rest of the unit. Now, the examples I just showed you were examples of the orcs failing those saves, but if the orc did roll that 6 that was required, then the wound would be negated and the orcs would not take any damage. So maybe it's the case that this Orc Boy, he was chosen by the Orc player to try to save these wounds. He rolled a 6 for the first one, and then rolled a 5 for the next one, which ended up killing him. Now, not to make things too complicated, this is actually a pretty straightforward process, particularly once you start playing a bit. But I do also want to bring up mortal wounds right now, because I just mentioned that weapons with extra damage, meaning more than 1 damage, so if a weapon dealt 2 or 3 damage per attack, those extra or excess damage is not carried over into the rest of the enemy unit even after it's killed a model. There is an exception to this, and that is mortal wounds. Mortal wounds represent damage that is just very powerful and can carry over into the rest of the unit. So let's pretend that the Space Marines here were firing weapons with mortal wounds, and those 2 wounds that we had earlier, let's say they weren't just normal wounds, but they were actually mortal wounds. And let's say that each of these wounds represented 2 damage that could be going into the orc unit there. Well, first off, mortal wounds cannot be saved, meaning you cannot make an armor save, a cover save, or an invulnerable save to try to ignore these wounds. They just are straight applied. The other thing that's different about mortal wounds is that if a wound is dealing 2 damage per attack and the model that you're hitting only has 1 wound, that excess damage is actually carried over into the rest of the unit. So if this was a mortal wound that dealt 2 damage and this is an Orc Boy with 1 wound, I would apply it to the Orc Boy, that would kill 1 for 1 wound, and then the second excess wound would actually be carried over and applied. In this case, it could be given to another Orc Boy, or 1 wound could be applied to the Orc Knob there. He has 2 wounds though, and so 1 wound would not be enough to kill him. So before we end part 4, the shooting phase, we should also talk about those other 2 saves that models can make. We've talked a lot about the armor save, which is the A value on their profile, which represents their basic armor that they're wearing. Armor saves, of course, are affected by a weapon's armor piercing value, and so armor saves can sometimes be reduced if a weapon has a lot of strength. But there are a couple other types of saves that you can make as well. One of the other kind of saves you're going to find is called a cover save. That represents models that are hiding in the terrain on the table. They may be on it or in it or behind it, but it obstructs the view of the shooting models targeting them. So if we take this example here with the Space Marines trying to fire into the orcs, where they have sort of this graded barrier in between them. Now the Space Marines can see the orcs, but the view is somewhat obstructed. In this case, if the model that is in cover is either slightly obstructed or in the terrain itself, it gets a bonus to its armor save. So the orcs have a natural 6 up armor save, but because they're getting some cover here from the terrain, their armor save actually goes to a 5+. So the last type of save that we have is something called an invulnerable save. And our Space Marine captain here, he actually has an invulnerable save. Let's take a look at his profile to show you what that looks like. So here's the profile of our Space Marine captain, and if you look up here, you'll see that he actually has a 3+ save. This is his armor save, the save that we've been talking about already. But he also has, under abilities, something called an Iron Halo, which is a 4+ invulnerable save. It's another type of save that the captain has because he's so tough. Now looking at this, you might ask yourself, well, if he already has a 3+ armor save, why would I ever want to use a 4+ invulnerable save? Well, this goes back to the fact that different weapons have different armor piercing values, and sometimes a weapon's armor piercing value will negate a model's armor save, meaning that their armor save, although the captain's here is a 3+, if he's hit by a really strong weapon, that 3+ save might become a 6+, or if it's even powerful enough, he might not get the save at all. What makes an invulnerable save so unique is that it cannot be affected by armor piercing values of an enemy weapon. So if the captain is hit by a strong weapon that has a strong armor piercing value that would maybe negate his 3+ save, he can instead choose to use his invulnerable save, which is a 4+, and the weapon's strength doesn't matter. Now if he's hit by a weapon that does mortal wounds, he doesn't get any of the saves. He just has to take mortal wounds. Invulnerable saves won't save you against a mortal wound. Something also to remember is that you can only use one of your saves when you're trying to save yourself from a wound. So you can't use your armor save and then use your invulnerable save. You have to choose which one you're gonna use. But you can actually switch which one you use between attacks. So if, one enemy attacks you and the weapon's armor piercing is so high that it would really hurt the captain's 3+ armor save, he may choose to use the 4 of invulnerable save to try to save himself against that attack. If the captain's hit by another attack, and in this case maybe the armor piercing value is not quite as strong as the prior attack, he may choose to use the 3+ armor save because it actually gives him better odds than the 4+. Now before we end this video, I want to bring up one last thing, and that is targeting character units. Now some models in the game are considered characters. They're usually unique and considered of high importance. So they're usually like your HQ choice. So in this case, our captain here, he is actually a character. The way you know that is you'll look on their profile, and under the keywords there, you'll see character. So we know he's a character. Whereas the rest of the Space Marines, they're not characters. Now why is that important to know with regard to shooting? Well, if the orcs want to target the Space Marines during their shooting attack, they can only target the troops of Space Marines here. They can't target the captain. Why is that? Because when models are shooting, the only way they're able to target a character unit is if the character unit is the closest model to them. If there are any non-character enemy units, of course, like the Space Marines here to the orcs, they have to target them instead. So in this case, if these boys over here were trying to shoot at the Space Marines, their only two options would be these two units of Space Marine troops. If the captain had found himself in a position where he is now out in front and the closest model to the orcs now have the opportunity to fire in at the captain. They of course can still choose to shoot at these two units of Space Marines, but they may want to try to pick off this captain as he's made himself an easy target. Alright, so that is it for the shooting phase. I know it got a little bit complicated. Feel free to watch this a couple times, read it in the book. It makes a lot of sense once you start playing it and you get used to the rules. Part 5, we're going to be discussing charging as well as the attack phase. So stay tuned, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit the like button, and if you're interested in seeing more Wolfpack Wargaming videos, go ahead and hit the subscribe.